Hello and welcome to Module 1. My name is Tanya Ha and I'm a science communicator and an environment journalist, and I'll be taking you through this module. You've already been through Module 0, the introduction to the masterclass. In Module 1, we will be looking at audience and strategy. These are the foundation for communicating effectively. Then we'll go on to Module 2, which will explore the templates and guides that we've provided that will help you write policy briefs and executive summaries for non-academic audiences, along with the other resources that are part of the program. Module 1, Understanding your audience to develop an impact strategy. Here is an overview of the structure of Module 1. We will start with the basics of identifying and understanding your intended target audience. Then we will look at laying the foundations. This is gathering the information that you will need to understand specifically who it is that you are speaking to and writing for through different ways of stakeholder mapping and audience analysis. Then we will get ready to write. It's important that we do all of this thought up front before we put pen to paper or fingers to the keyboard, because that way we can make sure communication is more effective and targeted. And finally, we will look at the tools, how you can use this information to inform your writing when you're producing a policy brief or executive summary. The aim of this module is to provide you with tools and insights that will help you to understand who you're writing for, because writing for audiences that are specific will make your work more effective. The outcome will be information and insights that you can apply to strategically communicating with the audiences that you need to influence in order to have impact. Right up front, it's important to clarify some terminology that we will be using throughout this masterclass. Who is your audience and who are your stakeholders? Your audience or audiences are the people you are talking to, the ones you are writing your policy briefs and executive summaries for. Now, your audiences are also stakeholders, but there are many more stakeholders outside of your target audience. These are the people and organisations that have a vested interest in the outcomes of your work or your policy recommendation. It's important to remember that they exist even when you're not targeting them specifically. Your work or your recommendations may impact them, and because of this, they may help your work and be important allies, or they may stand in the way of it. So it's important to understand their needs and their interests. Finally, it's important to understand that your audience and stakeholders exist within a broader ecosystem that includes the financial, the societal, the political, and other aspects that will influence the way your policy recommendations are implemented. Let's get into the basics. As researchers, you are likely to be used to communicating with an audience of your fellow researchers, and you will be used to using academic language and technical jargon that might not be understood by others outside your research field. But for research to have impact, it must be communicated to non-academic general audiences. Everything with communication starts and ends with your audience, what they understand, what might be too technical for them, and what they're interested in. You will communicate with several audiences in order to make your work increase its impact, and those audiences will have different interests and different needs to each other. Taking the time up front to think about your audiences and deciding who to target will increase your impact. Put simply, communication is the means by which you take an idea from your mind and convey it into someone else's mind. You can do this with words, pictures, and other means. Choosing the right words to convey the meaning is the key to successful communication. Take this example. The person communicating wants to talk about a specific animal they're researching. As an amphibian expert, they're very comfortable using biology's two-part scientific names, which use two Latin words to identify the genus and species. Ranoidea reniformis is meaningful to them and their fellow biologists. But if the listener is a non-expert, perhaps a policymaker, a journalist, or a local government parks officer who didn't study science past mid-high school, this might sound more like a Harry Potter spell. Words don't have meaning. It's the people who give them meaning. Keep Renoidio raniformis for scientific audiences, but use the common name growling grass frog for non-academic audiences. That way, even if the audience is unfamiliar with that specific species, by hearing just the last part, frog, they'll know roughly what kind of animal the scientist is talking about. Revisiting the earlier idea of understanding your audience in a policy context, we introduced this in Module 0. Remember that you are the researcher and that you've got a solution. Now, in order to communicate with the ultimate decision maker, you have to choose your language, your subject matter, and the words and things that you will focus on so that you can give policymakers information that will make it easier for them to brief the decision maker. This case study looks at how government scientists shared new research findings on the health of the Great Barrier Reef. While they have an obligation to provide a robust evidence base for policymakers, many more audiences are interested in this field. In 2012, the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the University of Wollongong published a study showing that the Great Barrier Reef had lost half of its coral cover in the last 27 years. It was published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The journal article itself contained a lot of detail, terms like ecosystem trajectories and nearest neighbour analysis, and detailed graphs with error bars. Who was interested in this research other than fellow scientists? Well, multiple levels of government, environmental NGOs and other environment groups, fisheries, tourism operators, the media, and the broader public, and even people who have simply watched and loved nature documentaries. Many of these would not understand terms like ecosystem trajectories or nearest neighbour analysis. To address this, the study findings were announced with a media release that took the complex science and told the story in simple language that was easy for everyone to understand. Specifically, that 48% of the loss was due to storm damage, 42% was due to crown-of-thorns starfish, and 10% due to bleaching. In the media release, the CEO of AIMS said, "We can't stop the storms, but perhaps we can stop the starfish. If we can, then the reef will have more opportunity to adapt to the challenges of rising sea temperatures and ocean acidification." The presentation of the information in this way identified crown-of-thorns starfish as a threat that could be feasibly addressed by national and subnational actors. In contrast, storm damage requires climate change action at a local and global level. So by taking this focus on something that subnational governments and national governments could work on, this led to impact. Eradication programs and policies for crown-of-thorns starfish were implemented. This illustrates the communication of complex science through a simple media release. Policy briefs and summary reports, well written for general audiences, can be adapted to produce media releases fairly easily. We will explore this later in Module 4. Thinking about both the Great Barrier Reef story and also your own writing for journals, academic audiences, traditionally you would present your research aim, method, results, discussion, and conclusion in that order. But when writing for non-academic or general audiences, we do what we call the reverse pyramid. These audiences are less interested in your methods and your aims. They are more interested in the conclusion where you talk about what you found or what the potential outcomes, benefits, and impacts are. So when you are writing policy briefs and executive summaries, don't use the traditional academic writing pyramid. Use the reverse pyramid or inverse pyramid, starting with outcomes and impacts. Now let's apply this thinking to some of the audiences that you'll be writing for in your work with the Energy in Buildings and Communities program. Remember, different audiences have different levels of understanding. They also have different drivers, different interests and passions. Different things are meaningful to them. Different people also have different communication and learning styles. Some are more visual, some are more verbal. And you can use this understanding to influence how you write and what you include in your writing. Here are some examples. If you're writing for people who have an economics background, economists might not understand technical engineering information, but for them, money speaks loudly. Economists are interested in financial information, so if there are financial benefits to what you are recommending, highlight that. People are interested in things that are local to them or that will affect them and their communities personally. So use examples or comparisons that are in the region where they live or in the region they have jurisdiction over. And remember that the kind of professional background that people have often relates to the kind of learner or communication style they prefer. So urban designers, for example, are highly visual people who respond to attractive imagery. So even if it seems only decorative, beautiful images can give your work more impact. They can make it more powerful. Now it's time to lay the foundations of good communication by looking at stakeholders. Let us take Annex 72 as an example of understanding the audience and the stakeholders involved in implementing the recommendations of an Annex's policy brief. Annex 72 is all about using life cycle assessment during the building design process. The key audience for this is policymakers who are involved with building standards and building regulation. The policymakers may not understand the knowledge gaps, the lack of consistency, or other things that are holding back building emissions reductions. These policymakers want solutions that will help government deliver on their commitments. In Australia, there is a net zero emissions by 2050 target that has been committed to. They want to enable other parts of society, such as industry, to play their part and take responsibility for their own emissions. It is not the job of government to take care of industry emissions. So part of the work of policymakers is to enable everyone across society to play their different roles. This illustrates the need to understand the different stakeholders involved in planning and designing buildings. The nature of your document depends on the audience. Understanding your audience will help you to use the language, style, and level of information that suits their needs and their subject matter knowledge. It will give them the understanding and language, importantly, that they can use to represent your findings or recommendations to decision makers. By giving them that language, you can avoid inaccuracies from creeping in. You may need to write different documents for different audiences. For example, research about residential indoor air quality may need to be expressed differently to policymakers working in housing compared to those working in population health. It's also important to note that in different countries, depending on where your annex and your colleagues are based, there may be different rules about how researchers can communicate with policymakers. Do make sure that you are complying with the local rules of your jurisdiction and also your research institute or university. We will use Annex 80 to introduce the idea of different audiences and their different areas of focus or information needs. Annex 80 aims to develop, assess and communicate solutions of resilient cooling and overheating protection. Policymakers that can benefit from their research want solutions that will help government ensure that building codes and regulations are fit for purpose, that they do their job of keeping buildings at a high standard, that cities are well designed, that they suit the climate and the livability needs of their communities, that people stay healthy and safe in a changing climate, particularly during heat waves, that the electricity supply will be able to withstand increasingly frequent climate events. These are all considerations that are important for government and that relate to the work of Annex 80. Annex 80 is all about resilient cooling applications that can make residential buildings more comfortable in a changing climate. Now, in this example, the key audience is policymakers who are involved in building standards. However, there is a broad number of stakeholders that have an interest in this. That includes people involved in health policy, preventing or responding to the increases in heat-related illness and deaths during heat waves. There is people involved in power supply who need to keep the electricity grid stable during times of high air conditioning use. And there are urban planners who may be able to incorporate cooling elements into urban design. These are important people to keep in mind when you're writing for policymakers who might be influenced by these other stakeholders. In analysing Annex 80 audiences and stakeholders, it's useful to do an exercise like the one we have pictured here as an example. Create a table in which you list the important stakeholders and think about and write down what you know of their interests and goals. So, for example, a main stakeholder group is the policy and government bodies that set the agenda for building codes. This might include a building department or ministers, the departmental secretary, or the senior leadership that are ultimately the decision makers. A building regulator might be involved as well. Their interests and goals are to ensure that policy is appropriate and well directed for the benefit of all citizens. They want to ensure that government money is well spent, that buildings are built to code, and that they are fit for purpose so that they keep people safe and comfortable. And they want to ensure that the energy grid is able to withstand future extreme heat waves. And you can repeat this exercise across other important interested stakeholders. Here we have mapped the target audience of policymakers in the context of the stakeholder environment that they operate in. You will see the orange-coloured policymakers shape towards the centre. That is your audience, the focus of your efforts. Now they are part of government and they also report to other people in government who are also connected to other sections of government. All of these government-related stakeholders are indicated by blue. This includes the policymakers and decision makers that you want to directly and indirectly communicate with, but there are others involved who will have an influence. I have also indicated in black people who have a vested interest with a profit motive in how we look after and cool our cities. And also there are citizens and the media who collectively express public opinion. I've indicated them in red. These are important people to keep in mind and will either have an awareness of the issue that your work impacts, or they might not have an understanding of it at all. Now this is where it gets interesting, when you start thinking about the complex relationships that there are within this setting that you are working on. The policymakers you are targeting, or one or two of many working in government, all of whom are trying to get information through to the ultimate decision maker that you want to have the attention of so that they can act on your subject matter area. But that's just some of the many voices that are influencing those decision makers. There are citizens and the media. They create public pressure on decision makers. They care about whether these cities are getting too hot, and they care about the fact that inner cities are hotter than coastal suburbs due to the urban heat island effect. And they care about what happens with their infrastructure. So they put pressure on decision makers. Decision makers also have pressure from lobbying from people who have commercial interests, the profit motive. Energy suppliers all have an interest in what's being done to cool cities, but also on the other side, the building profession will have an interest in building an urban planning policy. They will want to know if you are making it harder to build in their minds, or are you making it easier? And they will be lobbying the same decision makers that you want to influence. And the other organisations within government that are affected by these decisions will also have the ear of the decision maker. Gathering information is the way to understand that complex stakeholder map that I previously showed you. Information about your audience and stakeholders helps you to target and focus communication of the research to people who will make a difference, to do so in a way that has the greatest resonance, that is most impactful and meaningful to them. And it will also ensure that you do these while still being mindful of the other influential stakeholders that are within the ecosystem. The two main approaches to gathering information about your audiences and stakeholders that we will cover are stakeholder mapping and running a stakeholder panel or a focus group discussion, which gives you a deep dive into the motivations, workloads, pressures, and interests of your target audiences. Introducing stakeholder mapping. Stakeholder mapping is a useful exercise that helps you to understand the context your research will be applied in, including the social context and political environment, cultural considerations that might have an influence, and practical aspects that will influence your work. It seems like a complex exercise, but it is well worth doing, and you only need to do it once in detail and maybe do updates if or when it is needed. You can use your stakeholder maps to inform your policy brief or summary writing and other communication. And there are different ways to gather and present this information using different types of stakeholder map. The ultimate aim is to organise your thoughts and your understanding of the key players, relationships and function of the stakeholder ecosystem where your work can be applied to have impact. All right, now it's time to get practical. So you have had your introduction to stakeholder mapping. Now it is time to think about your annex and think about the work that you are doing and then developing your own stakeholder map and audience analysis. So with activity 1, there are 2 steps to it. The first is to brainstorm who your stakeholders are. So that's your broader ecosystem of people who could be interested, and then to group those. Then we will jump into activity 2, which shows 2 different ways of mapping, either by priority or by relationships. And I will go through what that means when we get to it. Now, remember that these activities are backed up in your workbook with a particular sheet for each activity. The activity sheet will take you through the steps and give you a bit more information. So if you want to run a group workshop based around this masterclass, you can use those resources. Let's get into it. Step 1 is to do that brainstorming that I mentioned now. We have some prompts here on the slide, but you really need to think about your own context, the country you are in, the region you are in, such as the European Union, the Americas, or the Oceania area. That will impact who your stakeholders are specifically. But here are some to trigger your thought processes and brainstorming. For example, government ministers, political parties from governments. Don't forget about financial institutions, the media, national NGOs, that's non-governmental organisations, religious institutions, they might have an influence. Indigenous people, they are very important to consider. So in your group, sit around a table and brainstorm who these are. Make a list or draw a table, whatever works for you. The next stage then, step 2, is to take that list of stakeholders from your brainstorm and to group them. And this will give you a sort of an idea of the sectors that could be of interest that you could focus on. And those sectors will have similar interests that you can then use to tailor your content. So you've got your list of stakeholders, you've grouped them. Now it is time to think about where they sit. You can do that by priority or you can do that by relationships. The option that you choose depends on how complex the issues are that you are dealing with, the topic you are researching, and with the complexity of the environment in which that information is being shared and acted upon. So mapping by priority, it's a quick and simple exercise where the centre states the people that are your highest priority and then you move out, whereas mapping by relationship is very much targeted at a more complex environment of stakeholders where they're really influencing each other and you need to know how that all fits around your particular topic. So let's jump into what that looks like. Now it is time to think about how to target the right ones, the right audiences from your list of stakeholders and how you grouped them and how to identify your target audience. One of the ways is mapping by priority. So there are 2 slides to this and 5 steps. Have a note taker draw this on a whiteboard or a big piece of paper. Start by drawing concentric circles. Put your highest priority stakeholders in the middle and then work your way out, working through your list. Now your highest priority audience is the one or ones who can create the most impact as a result from understanding your research. Now they are the ones that you should be making the most effort to reach. They are the ones that you want to have in mind when you're creating your communications. The fourth step is to then take those priorities, these central stakeholders, and to see if you can specify who they are. If, for example, your priority was a non-governmental organisation or NGOs, a specific important one might be the World Green Building Council. Or is it a specific department within the federal government you're targeting, or your national government, or the European Union? Now, this is where you become a bit more specific so that you can start looking at how do they use language? What are they interested in? As you are doing this work, discuss why are they a priority? What do they want to know from your research? What do you want them to do with your research? And start making notes of these sorts of things. Here is a closer view of an example of a simple priority stakeholder map and what it might look like for a climate change adaptation program in Greece. And you can see the source that we've referenced here at the bottom of the screen. A second option for who your critical audience will be and the context they operate in is by mapping by relationships. The stakeholder map we looked at earlier when exploring Annex 80 stakeholders is an example of mapping by relationship. Here is another example. This one shows mapping by relationships as part of identifying and analysing stakeholders involved in climate change adaptation processes in Sweden. So, how to do it? Again, there are 5 steps to this. Using your stakeholder map and priority list, choose your target audience. Write the target audience in the centre of a whiteboard or a large piece of paper, and then add the other stakeholders on your list one by one and map the relationships through drawing lines between them. Also, not just relationships with the central stakeholder, but also relationships between each other. So, for example, the Australian Green Building Council would have a close relationship with the World Green Building Council, so there could be a line between those two. You could be targeting them in particular, and they could be talking to a ministry. So that's another example. You can also use different line styles and colours to provide further information. For example, you could place stakeholders in higher or lower positions to indicate hierarchy on the map, or you could use line styles to indicate a particular type of relationship. Here is an example of a relationship map that uses different colour and line styles to indicate different types of relationship among the stakeholders involved in reducing the amount of food waste disposed of in landfill in the Melbourne Greater Metropolitan Area. You can see, for example, some blue lines show funding relationships and others show where levies are paid, indicating the flow of money. There are other colours for service provision, for governance relationships, and so on. A panel approach allows you to take a deeper dive into the audience because you have live people in the room. You can have conversations with them. It's a facilitated discussion that allows you to get insights into their lives and their work and the pressures that they're under. A panel discussion is similar to the focus group research method that is used in social sciences. It involves an informal discussion with people from a group with a common interest to gain insights and their perspectives. These sessions are particularly good for helping a large number of researchers understand their stakeholders better, so that if you have a large team and you want all of them to understand the policymakers or the different stakeholders that are acting on their subject matter area, then this is the way that everyone can gain those insights all at once. 3 policymakers joined us at the International Energy Agency Energy in Buildings and Communities program Impact Masterclass pilot on the 20th of November in 2024. And we recorded that panel discussion so that you can gain some insights from an Australian policymaking perspective. Visit the YouTube link provided to watch the discussion. Many researchers who took part in the pilot workshop said that the panel was a highlight and gave them really useful information, so we do encourage you to listen. Now it is time to get ready to write. Now you understand your target audience, the policymakers you are writing for, and you understand the context that they exist in and the communications from you to them and through them onto the ultimate decision maker. So how do you use this to choose what you write about? What information should go into your document? Now we are going to look at tools to identify your information strategy. That is, what information are you going to include in your policy brief or executive summary? Now these documents are going to be short, around 2 pages, but you have a lot of information at your fingertips because you are the expert. You might have technical reports that run to, say, 150 pages or more. Policymakers would not have time to read those, so you have to be very careful in choosing what information to include in your writing, as well as how you present it. So, introducing activity 3, we will get you to ask yourself some questions that will help you to focus on the language approach that you use in choosing information. A series of questions that we will run through will lead to an outline of the information that your target audience needs to enable them to use and apply your research. Remember that each stakeholder or audience will have different information needs. They'll have different interests and different things that they can apply. Matching the style of language and the information included in the document to the audience will increase the chance of uptake. Let's get to know these people better. In a policy context, the decision maker is the person that can ultimately turn your research into action that benefits society. The decision maker is usually an elected representative, such as a member of parliament or a minister, who considers the information that you provide along with other information collated by their advisors, departmental secretaries, and other organisations within government. Identify what drives them and what information they will need from the policymaker that you are working with. And we will look at that in our next activity. You will need to identify their level of understanding. Does the minister or the member of parliament that has decision-making power have a background in building sustainability? Do they understand carbon issues? Do they have an interest in this subject? Try to identify their level of understanding. Also, think about what might turn them off. What might make them reject your idea, and what other competing interests might they be considering? Now we come to the policymaker. That's the person you have direct contact with in government, and it is via this person that you are getting information through to the decision maker. Now, it might seem like a strange or obvious thing to say, but make sure you have the right person. Policy advisors in government can change positions and responsibilities, so make sure you are up to date with the current organisational chart and that you are dealing with someone who has the responsibility in the area that you are working on. Do not assume that once you have told someone in government that your policy recommendations will eventually get passed on to the appropriate person. Typically, they won't. Identify the information that they will need. We will explore this in our next activity. Think about how long it should be. Short is the clue. What tone should it have? What kind of language should you use? Should it be positive? Should it have a call to action? How much urgency should you express? How pressing is the issue? Now remember that this policymaker might have subject matter expertise, but the senior policy advisors and decisions that they report to are more likely not to. So you do have to keep your information simple for all of these audiences, just in case. Give the policymaker simple language in your writing so that they can pass your information on to others without needing to interpret it themselves. It is when we give complex information to policymakers who then have to interpret it when they pass it higher up that inaccuracies and misinterpretation can creep in. You want to avoid that. So now it's time to get our hands dirty again with activity 3. In activity 1, you identified your stakeholders. In activity 2, you looked at your target audience and the stakeholder context they operate in. Now it is really time to think about that target audience and to really dig into what they need to know, because that will underpin the structure of your communication, as we have just discussed. This activity raises 4 questions for you to think about, and we are going to run through them in consecutive slides. So get out your workbook, get out your activity 3 worksheet, and let's get going. The questions we will be asking are, who are they? Do you know specifically? How do you want them to act? What do you want them to do? And what do they want to know? What is important to them? This will help you choose what to focus on. And what do they already understand about the subject? So that will help you to get your pitch just right. So that first question is, who are they? So if you take the outcomes from activities 1 and 2, choose your target audience and then see if you can narrow it to an individual. Do you have a name? Do you have a job role or job title for them? Do you have an idea of the specific person who can use the outcomes of your research? Note these down for all of those particular target audiences that you may be working on. There could be one, there could be several. So what are their names, titles, any specific information about that person? For example, if you are working with a policy advisor that has a built environment background and is working with a minister that has had the portfolio for a while, this is useful information to know as it tells you that you do not need to provide as much background information. Whereas if it is somebody who, say, comes from a finance background who is giving advice in the housing space, then you would target that very differently. So that's useful. That's the usefulness of knowing exactly who it is. So you know who it is. Now what do you want them to do? What action do you want them to take? With that specific person and their role in mind, what policy levers or policy instruments are relevant to their role, or would you recommend they implement? What do you want them to do with that information? With the summary or with your policy recommendations, what does it look like if they get implemented, and how is this different than what is there at the moment? Now, this is a perfect activity to sit around the table and discuss with your Annex colleagues. Take the specific person and their role in mind. What do you want them to know about? Therefore, how do we target the information from our research towards that? It can even be something that you discuss early in your Annex's work, where you identify the people you want to reach and influence and discuss what they're interested in, and that could then direct or refine how your research is developed. So that we can better understand policy levers or policy instruments, let's see how one of the example policy briefs that we've produced, that for Annex 80, has applied different policy levers in its recommendations. So this particular policy brief is codifying cool surfaces to protect people and the grid during heat waves. You can see from the recommendations for policymakers, those recommendations are expanding cool roof policies to include cool walls accounting for roof wall differences in materials and physics, expand existing requirements in the National Construction Code, offer rebates for manufacturers or homeowners to offset initial cool surface product premiums, and create a training and certification program for roof and wall contractors. So you can see there's some actions in there that have been recommended. The policy recommendations that were made for Annex 80 can all be looked at as one of 3 types of policy lever or policy instrument, and we have provided an overview of these different kinds here. Each instrument can be applied in one of 2 ways: affirmative actions or measures that encourage the desired behaviour, or negative measures that discourage the behaviours we want to reduce, replace, or end. The first type of policy instrument is regulation. We nickname that the stick. Regulations govern what people and corporations are allowed to do by law. For example, a minimum standard of performance in equipment or systems is a legal requirement that sets a performance baseline, encouraging the marketplace to equal this or to do better. An example of a negative regulation is one that discourages the use of materials or equipment of concern, and this is a staged phase out or a ban of these items. The second type of policy instrument is economic means, which we call the carrot, as it rewards the change that policymakers are seeking. This includes financial incentives and disincentives. An affirmative example is subsidies, grants, and in-kind support, such as funding for research and development into a particular type of desired technology. A negative example is taxes that discourage a particular behaviour, such as congestion tax to reduce car use or waste levies to penalise wasteful behaviours and encourage resource efficiency. The third type of policy instrument provides information. We call this the sermon. An affirmative example is encouragement to provide information through disclosure to the marketplace, and a negative example is warnings that communicate the consequences of undesirable behaviours and information to help people make better choices. So here is another look at the Annex 80 recommendations, this time looking at how they use the policy levers that we just saw. The first recommendation to expand cool roof policies to include cool walls uses two policy levers. The stick, which uses an affirmative regulation or prescription applied to building standards, and information, or the sermon, which uses encouragement policy instruments in the form of changes to rating and certification programs. The second recommendation involves changes to the construction code. Again, the policy lever is regulation, or the stick. The third recommendation offers a rebate, a financial incentive, clearly a carrot, a policy lever that uses affirmative economic means to encourage the desired change. And the final recommendation, providing a training and certification program for contractors, is an information policy lever that builds the capacity of the sector. Moving on to the next question, what do they want to know and what do they need to know? So you have identified who they are and you have identified how you want them to change things. What do they need to know to enable that? What is important to them? Thinking about this in your workshop around the table with your annex will help you to choose what to focus on in your executive summary or policy brief. This includes the key points or recommendations, but also the contextual or background information that you should include that shows why this is important here and now. In the workbook, we have created a table for you to write down this information. What do they already know is a really important question because you don't want to oversimplify things and you do not want to make it too complicated either. So as you prepare ways to communicate to your target audience, you need to think about which subject areas are likely to be familiar or unfamiliar to them. For example, if you are talking about indoor air quality, is it an economic or finance department or a human health department? Dailies or disability adjusted life years will mean very little to the finance department, but people at the human health department will know what that means. So the level of detail you are going into and the simplification you employ are determined by your estimate of what they already know. And again, this will help you to write for them, to target them and to make them feel comfortable with the information you are giving them so that they make the decision to take it to the next steps. Language is critical. You want to make a document that is really easy to understand. To do that, you really need to keep a few things in mind. First and foremost, your audience is under pressure. Most public servants have many policy areas that they are working on in addition to yours. So making things as easy for them to understand as possible is crucial. They have limited time, so keep your policy briefs short. They don't have time to read long reports. They may have a limited understanding of your topic, so keep the language simple, avoid jargon and unnecessary detail. And it's helpful to do some of their thinking for them. Don't assume that they will connect the dots, that they will understand that one aspect has a bearing on another and linking those two things together. Digest the information for them. Spell out what it means in practical real-world terms. For example, if your work relates to urban cooling in an area where there have been deaths linked to heat waves, spell out that implementing your recommendations could save lives. Make it easy for them, for example, by writing shorter sentences. Shorter sentences are much easier to read. The longer, complex sentences are harder. Getting practical with the writing, remember how we discussed earlier the difference between writing for general audiences and academic writing? Remember, you use the reverse pyramid. Put the important outcome information, the impact information, up first. Don't spend much time on the methods. Only include a brief mention of how you came to the findings or the recommendations if that is important for giving the reader confidence in the rigour of your approach. Here are some tips for writing in plain language. To start with, avoid using acronyms. There are far too many acronyms in government. If you must use them, always write what the acronym stands for in full the first time, such as World Health Organization, and thereafter use the acronym WHO. Follow the version of English that is used by the operating agent and agree on a single English version for the annex. So that might be UK English, American or US English, or Australian English, or another. Now there are some exceptions. I might be writing in Australian English, but when I spell report titles, proper nouns or organisation names, like the World Health Organization, that uses American English spelling conventions, which uses Z instead of S in organisation. So the American English spelling of organisation in World Health Organization is used in Australian English and UK English documents because that is its name. Use active voice, which is clear, direct, and easily understood. So here is an example of the same information presented in two different ways. For active voice, ventilation improved indoor air quality. The passive version, indoor air quality was improved by ventilation. Active voice puts emphasis in the right place. It is also really important to understand that some words are commonly misunderstood or have different meanings for different audiences, and this is particularly the case in climate change communication. I have included a table here that has some examples of scientific terms, the public meaning for them, or the way the word is interpreted or misinterpreted by general audiences, along with suggestions for a better choice of words that simplify it in plain English for these audiences. Take, for example, in scientific circles, we are quite comfortable talking about uncertainty, but the broader public takes you to mean that if you are uncertain about something, you are ignorant, you don't know a lot about the subject. So a way to communicate the uncertainty around some data is to talk about the range of different values that it might be. Similarly, manipulation. We are comfortable about adjusting data and making mathematical calculations, and that is referred to as manipulation in academic circles. But the public meaning of that word is that it is illicit tampering. It has a sinister sound. So instead of writing about data manipulation, you could refer to it as scientific data processing. Use this list in the table and keep in mind how people might misunderstand the words that you are using. It is also helpful to get somebody from a different background who doesn't have your subject matter knowledge to read your documents, and they can ask you to clarify anything that they don't understand or that causes concern. Now onto the tools, how you will apply this to writing your policy brief or executive summary. Here is how we have applied these considerations we've talked about to Annex 80, focused on resilient cooling of buildings. So we've looked at the stakeholders, including the department and ministers, and their interests and goals. They want to ensure that government money is well spent. They also want to make sure that government plays its role only, not the role of industry or others. So you will see in the recommendations for policymakers, we've written about developing policy and regulatory changes for industry and rebates for manufacturers and homeowners. This policy approach provides regulation and incentives upstream for the manufacturer with benefits flowing down to the consumer. Consumers who are homeowners are able to get a rebate, which helps drive demand and influence industry. So we make sure that the role of industry is written into the policy recommendations. Similarly, training, certification programs and standards is something that government can do that will influence the ability of industry to play its role. So you can see from those recommendations how they are taking into account government interests and goals. Here is another look at Annex 80 from the point of view of understanding how stakeholder mapping and analysis can help you make your writing persuasive and powerful. Now, it is always good to give an example to make something more tangible. Heat waves are among the most lethal natural hazards. They are exacerbated in population centres such as Tokyo, Los Angeles, New York, London, Milan, Mumbai, and Athens. Here's where you can specify areas that might mean something to your target audience. So in this case, we're writing for Australia, where many cities, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Sydney, all have areas and suburbs that are prone to urban heat island effect and are affected by heat waves quite severely. In this instance, we chose to specify Western Sydney because it is a very vulnerable community for urban heat island effect. It is literally a hotspot. It can be several degrees hotter in Western Sydney than on Sydney's coastline during heat waves. Constituents who live there are affected by this heat. They have elected representatives that might champion this issue. Western Sydney is also a population growth area and an economic growth area. There are businesses that are being set up there. So in short, it is politically, strategically, and socially important. So by stating this specific place as an example, I am hopefully getting the attention of the policymaker who knows that Western Sydney is politically important, and the decision maker knows this as well, and this will ultimately lead to progress for the policies that we're suggesting in this field. For an example of an executive summary, we decided to look at Annex 86, which is focused on energy efficiency in indoor air quality provision, looking at health costs as well as energy efficiency financial gains. We chose to write an executive summary based on these research findings because it represents one of those moments where new findings could change policies that are currently in effect. In the media, they would call this a stop press moment. This is the kind of document you write when your findings lead you to think, this changes things and government needs to know this information as soon as possible. So I will write a short 2-page summary to make sure they're aware of the changing evidence base. The real-world context of this research is important. There is already work being done to save energy and reduce carbon emissions by operating indoor air quality management more efficiently. This might involve measures such as reducing ventilation rates. This research looked at these ventilation practices and their effects on the levels of certain indoor air pollutants and projected the occupant health impacts, and found that saving money through energy efficient but less effective indoor air management may be a false economy when you consider the broader financial cost and health impacts that come from poorer indoor air quality. Putting that in the context of Australia, 10 to 11% of Australia's gross domestic product is spent on the health budget. So understanding that balance between energy efficiency and the need to power active ventilation, the financial and carbon savings may well be small in comparison to possible costs of the health impacts of poor indoor air quality. And we have specified there that long-term exposure to certain air pollutants can lead to conditions like lung cancer, asthma, and leukemia. Asthma in particular has high incidences in a country like Australia. So again, we're choosing to mention things that are meaningful locally for this audience. Once you have done your stakeholder map and you understand the potential reach and influence of your research, you can use this to take the plain language written work that you have done and recycle that work into information that's going to share your research further. So, for example, a policy brief could be rewritten into a media release that gets media attention, which in turn builds public awareness of the issue you are addressing. You can also do social media posts. For example, if your policy recommendations are published as an online story for your university, write social media posts for X or Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. to share them with a broader community, draw attention to your work, and establish yourself as a thought leader in your research field. You can also use this information to write news stories for your annex. Because you've already written it in easy to understand language, it will be perfect for sharing amongst energy and buildings and communities colleagues and beyond. And you can also adapt it with different information to write articles that target different audiences. You might have written your original brief about green infrastructure for a public health audience, for example, but you could edit it to better suit the interests and information needs of urban landscaping audiences and share it with these stakeholders. And that brings us to the end of Module 1. We see Modules 0, 1 and 2 as the core information that you will need to take the resources we've provided to produce policy briefs and executive summaries. But you can do more with this work. Module 2 will take you step by step through the use of the writing guides and templates that have been produced for you to help you write policy briefs and summaries that are similar to the examples that have been used in Module 1. Modules 3, 4 and 5 are specialised shorter modules. These are really useful deep dives into some specific audiences and avenues for communication. Module 3 focuses on government and industry, understanding what motivates these audiences and how to adapt your work to reach and influence them. Module 4 focuses on public and media, which is very important if your work is in a field that has a lot of public interest, or alternatively, if it has low public awareness, and building that public awareness will help create the kind of social acceptability, the drive to implement the kinds of policies that you are recommending. Finally, Module 5 has a strategic social media focus, looking at how you can use social media to build your profile and increase the influence of your work so that it can be applied to benefit society. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in Module 2, where Caroline Pidcock will guide you through using the writing guides and templates and other resources we have provided.